Hi, this is Dr. Harriet Fraad with another episode of Capitalism Hits Home, a show dedicated to exploring the effects of capitalism on gender, family, and relationships. Before I begin today's episode is on gender, but before I even begin it, I want to answer a question by a listener, Nicholas Magallanes. I hope, Nicholas, that I'm pronouncing your name correctly. He said that there is more and more tachophobia in the United States, and he asked me to help him understand it. Tachophobia is an omnipresent, terrifying fear of pregnancy, even if that isn't in the offing, even if it's an utterly unrealistic fear. Well, tachophobia, like all symptomatic behavior, holds two contradictory needs within the same symptom. In tachophobia, which is more prevalent now, women are both drawn to the power of creating a life, which is a tremendous power, but on the other hand are terrified because pregnancy is one of the predictors of poverty for women in the United States, and also women are utterly unsupported in terms of our government, in terms of their pregnancy. Trump is even thinking of withdrawing money from the infants and nutritions and pregnant infants, nutritions and pregnant mothers nutritional program that helps poor pregnant mothers and their infants develop normally because they get proper nutrition. There isn't the kind of child care support and after-school support and summer support that every other wealthy developed country provides and that many other non-wealthy countries provide. In fact, the U.S. is one of 4 nations in the entire world that don't give paid maternity leave, and those others are Somalia, Swaziland, and Papua New Guinea. Very poor countries. So here we are. Thank you, Nicholas Magallanes. I was glad to try to explain that to you. And now I'd like to talk today about gender, because MeToo is a gender struggle, and the constant sexual revelations have to do with gender, and there is a pressure everywhere as women are suing, whether they're the soccer team that always wins and gets much less than the male soccer team that always loses for the United States, or whether we're talking about promotions within companies or access to jobs in science, engineering, technology, or mathematics, which are male-dominated fields, as our business. There was an expose of the horrendous sexual predation and sex abuse at Harvard Business School, which was a male prestige enclave. At any rate, before I talk about gender, what I'd like to do is define what I'm talking about. There are 2 aspects to sexuality. One is biology. Has to do with the sex organs one has and the chromosomal and hormonal structure of the body. That's sex. Gender is a social construction. A child's gender identity is permanently set between 1.5 and 3 years old. When children are hot out of the womb, people don't say, "Hey, it's a child." They say it's a girl, it's a boy. And the nurses in the hospital interact differently with the little blue bundles and the little pink bundles. And from then on, children are programmed into one or another gender identity. Some enlightened nations like Sweden don't use gender pronouns in their child care centers, which are very well funded and public. They try to be sure that children have access to toys that are not gender stereotyped. These are very, very rare initiatives unknown in the United States. But gender is a social role. Brains adapt to fit in with the social expectations that exist in a society. Male and female brains are identical at birth There's a new book out that meticulously goes through all the studies. It's called The Gendered Brain by Gina Rippon. And what the studies show is that at birth, there are no differences in the male and female brain. But since our brains are tiny when we're born, the size of a small fist like this, or the size of a small apple, and the size of a Nerf football by the time we die, the neural connections that create the brain are social. We are social animals. Human beings have never existed alone. And the neural connections are what builds the brain. And they're connected on the basis of social cues, which male and female children get differently from the time they're born. Now, for a long time, for most of our history really, until the 1970s, the gendered differences were emphasized in preparation for different life expectations. In our dominantly white country at that time, white males were given 2 bonuses, one for being white and another for being male, in a scarce labor system. Men got family wages where they could support a family of dependents. Women were to take care of men in the household, do domestic labor, do emotional labor, do social labor of connecting their men to friends and relatives, take care of children, and do sexual labor, meet men's needs. This was turned on its head by capitalists who abandoned the white American male. They no longer really had a scarce labor market. They could export jobs. They could outsource them to places that pay very little and have no or scarce benefits, places like India, Pakistan, which make barely a dollar a day, or China, the best paid, that make an average of $3.26 an hour. I'm sorry, it was 44 cents or $1.49 an hour in Pakistan and India, whereas it's up to $3.26 in China. And I do remember the spokesman from Apple saying that, of course, he needs his screens for his cell phones, the Apple phone and the iPhone, made in China, because when he wanted a change in the screen, he could do there what he can't. They could summon the workers at 2 o'clock in the morning, give them a little tea, and make them get to work so that he could get those screens out on the date promised. He couldn't have gotten away with those labor practices in the United States, and he bragged about how wonderful that it is that he could do that. And, of course, ignore the social cost and the physical cost on those laborers, who were not compensated extra, of course. They were in China, where there are very few labor protections. And so work was computerized, robotized, mechanized, and outsourced. And millions upon millions of white male jobs left the country, because big capitalism is international. Trump's idea, "Make America Great Again," is an idea spouted by someone wearing a "Make America Great Again" MAGA red hat made in China, as most of the flags they wave are. Now, what happened was, starting in the 70s, as male jobs disappeared, white male jobs, and here I ought to parenthetically explain that minority men, black men, never got family wages as a rule. In a racist system, they were assigned the lower paid jobs, and one way to disrupt the labor movement was to separate them out by race. Black women have always had to work outside the home to support families, and have also had more independence, been alone more, spoke up more, been more militant, because they've been more independent and less dependent on a male wage, since their men didn't get a male family wage. Now, knowing that and going on, women were forced out of the home, where white women joined their minority sisters in the labor force. They went from 25% of women working outside the home in 1965 to about between 80%, about 80% of women working outside the home now. 60% of women with children under 2 are in the labor force, at least part-time. And they're not only in the labor force because they want independence. They're in the labor force for survival. Because now, with men unable to support families, 42% of all children are born outside of a marriage. And the family structure has changed. As women, we had a movement behind us to help us make that change. The women's movement, which was then the women's liberation movement, liberation from a limited stereotyped role in the household, supported women to have careers, to have hopes beyond domestic hopes. And there was nothing to support men in those changes. It should be said that one of the things that happened at that time is that there was, in the early women's movement, there was class content. As one of the founding mothers, I can attest that we thought, because we were at the bottom, black women, white women together, we were at the bottom. If we stood up, we'd bring the whole society with us and have an equitable and equal and nurturing society. There was real class organization there. The early Women's Journal from New York, notes from the first year in 1968, had articles about how class transformation is absolutely essential to our struggle. If we want all women to stand up, then we have to address class matters. The U.S. government, the FBI, and the CIA became alarmed and created something called the Great Wurlitzer, where they invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in paying CIA agents and FBI agents. People like Gloria Steinem, a certified CIA agent, was to go in and make the women's movement a gender-only movement and excise class from the discussion. That was quite successful because she brought in a lot of money. And we were so naive, we didn't realize, isn't it wonderful she brought us Ms. Magazine, so slick and beautiful and no ads. Uh-oh, who provided the money? We didn't even think that way. How foolish in a capitalist system. At any rate, that was a largely successful maneuver because the Black liberation movement became Black power and without whites, a race-only movement, and the women's movement became a gender-only movement instead of gender and class together. And in so doing, a lot of women who had to work for a living, a lot of single mothers and Black women withdrew from the women's movement. With the desertion of big capitalism from the labor force in the United States, and women pouring out to work, gender, the social roles for which women and men were groomed, women to be dependent, to please men, to worry about how good-looking we are because attracting a man was attracting support for life, men to be strong, to be aggressive, to be in command, to be unemotional, women to be emotional enough for both partners and children. All of that was called into question. Women to be sexually submissive, that was called into question. And at this point, the MeToo and Timesup movements are movements of women who say, wait a minute, that gender stereotype, that when men prey on us, we're to be ashamed? That just because Eve was blamed in the Bible, we're to blame? Men have to be responsible for their own predations against us. And Timesup is the same thing for women who don't have the money to sue themselves and need help in having lawyers and publicity around sexual exploitation in the factory, on the farm, etc. And so those gender roles that prepared us for a system that was dominant until the 1970s are no longer valid. They're outmoded. Women have outgrown them with a lot of support from a women's movement. A lot of men are confused, don't know what to do. The MeToo movement is a perfect example where they think, wait a minute, we're supposed to make the moves. They're supposed to pretend they don't want our sexuality because they're not supposed to have an aggressive sexuality. So we have to be twice as aggressive. What is this? And women are saying, no, consent. We have to be considered sexual equals and gain consent. I remember when I was a very young woman, my car broke down and I had to get a ride. And a young man stopped. He seemed nice. I thought, well, I've got to get a ride. I had to get downtown to catch a bus. And I said in the car, isn't it sad that I get into your car and I'm worried about sexual predation? Because I was already a feminist by then, that we can't just be people. And the young man said to me, I was worried that maybe I'm expected to make a sexual move on you, and I don't want to. And we ended up having a good discussion around what were the roles for which women and men were groomed at that time. And those roles have been revolutionized. They've been totally transformed. Because women have to work now. Most women have to work. It's only maybe the top 5 or 10% of families which could live on a male income, and because the separation or divorce rate is the overwhelming majority, not legal, but de facto, because it's 50% legal separation and divorce, and then another 15 to 20% of people who just split and don't go through the legal system, so that even women at the top often feel they have to go to work because they don't know if the settlement they get will support them, because the divorce rate is so real and so present. And therefore, those expectations that women will be protected in the household for the rest of our lives, if we're married and mothers and white, and that men will be providers and will be served in the household, that's gone. And with it, the gender identity, the markers of gender identity are going and gone. And women have much more support in adjusting to that. Men have either adjusted and tried to be equals and friends and lovers and two consenting adults in an equal relationship, but there has been a huge defection of men from that reality, trying to hold on to a gender role for which there's no longer the conditions of economic or social existence. And men have gone to hide. One of the big places that men have hidden is pornography, a huge industry, 17 billion as I recall. And heterosexual porn is porn in which women are sexually submissive and humiliated. Homosexual porn is more egalitarian, but many heterosexual men have retreated into porn to hurt their egos that were developed thinking that they would be a power in their household that could command the labor of women, sexual, emotional, and social. Another one is gun culture. It is not an accident that all the mass shooters have been men. The NRA is a misogynist organization. They sell targets called the ex-girlfriend target, in which you shoot once or twice, you just elicit blood flowing. By the time you finish shooting, she's demolished. They don't have an ex-boyfriend target to match. Another is the hate on the net. People like Alex Jones and others using revenge porn and other tactics to humiliate women sexually and emotionally is another refuge for men who have not adjusted to a different economic and social gender identity that calls for equality and companionship and friendship and connection rather than male dominance. Another one is the U.S. Army, in which women are routinely raped to create male dominance. That's in the news, and if you doubt me, look up rape in the military. It's right there. Kristen Gillibrand, who's running for president, has established her reputation as somebody pushing that issue. And another refuge, is evangelical religions, because the Baptist Convention on Men and Women requires that women be subordinate to men. If you are a Southern Baptist or any of the fundamentalists allied, a woman cannot be in a position superior to a man. She can't take a job as a supervisor if men are to be supervised and under her command. She cannot take a job as a manager if men are to be under her command. She can't be a minister. She can be in the ladies' auxiliary or a secretary, but she can't be a minister. This is another refuge. It doesn't work so well because women who work all day don't want to be under the command of a man to work another day and a second shift when they get home, so that the red states with the highest evangelical populations have the highest rates of divorce, and the overwhelming majority of those divorces are initiated by women. The good news is here that men and women can now be different sexes but claim a gender identity which is a comradely identity, that men and women are partners, are equal humans, taking on their domestic lives, their work lives, and their recreational lives, and their sexual lives as equals. That when people go out together, if either one wants to initiate sex, they need the consent of the other. And the old stereotypes that women are supposed to be giggling and saying no while they consent is over. And MeToo is there to corroborate it, calling men out thousands and thousands of times every day. Men in other countries that support gender initiatives better have been very successful in this. The whole Scandinavian countries, whether Finland, Iceland, Norway, Denmark, any of those, Sweden, in those countries, women single mothers even, earn 98% of what men earn. And single mothers get priorities in housing, clothing allowances, and so on. In other countries, there is the kind of demand for time to interact with family that exists not only for women who have to take part-time jobs because they're in charge of families, but for men. I've mentioned this before because it's so typical. The German Metal Workers Union, which is hundreds of thousands of workers in Germany, struck. And they won. And they got a 22-hour work week in order to achieve work-life balance so that they could see their families and their children, so that they could be in charge of their children. All of the other Western industrialized countries have paid vacations. We're the only one that doesn't, so that they can bond together, so that they can build together. That's why we have the highest divorce and separation rate, because we have the least supports for family, and the evangelicals, who make the most big deal about family, are the least supportive of those things that would help, like quality childcare, maternity and paternity leaves, family vacation time, and time off for family emergencies. What has happened because of this gender sea change initiated by the conditions of economic existence shifting for families is that it's opened the question of gender and opened the possibility for men and women to be equals, friends, and lovers together. It's also opened the possibility, which is something that the right-wing Republicans, I should say they are another refuge for male supremacy, but not for the conditions of existence of a family wage, of course. And there is one historical experiment in which male supremacy reigned while women were forced into the workforce at low wages, and that is the Third Reich, Nazi Germany, where women were required to work up to 60 hours a week in munitions factories and were paid low pay because their work was considered not their true vocation, which is taking care of men and children. And in one of the ironies, they weren't allowed birth control, something that the right-wing Republicans are working on, and certainly not abortion. But the birth rate went down because women were working so hard they couldn't conceive. They were ill and weak, or they couldn't sustain a pregnancy. So that the fascist family is what the right wing is trying to promote. And those who want to promote it is another refuge for men and some women who can't accept the changed gender reality. And so as we look at gender, which comes up over and over again, whether it's looking at transgender people and condemning them because they don't fit into a stereotype, or whether it's in MeToo with the gender stereotype of women's submissiveness when they're preyed upon and assaulted, and women's inability to speak up, which is changing, and women are speaking up. Whether they're there or anywhere else, we're surrounded by this. Because we are in a gender sea change. And the more that people can recognize that and look for relationships that are cooperative, like a cooperative on every level, the more men and women can be friends, lovers, equals, together. Because those people in those refuges that are fighting it, whether they're the right-wing Republicans, the revenge porn and misogyny people on the net, or the army with its rape culture, or the NRA, or heterosexual porn, are trying to revive gender expectations of men's dominance that have no longer any economic foundation in our society. So we need to wake up to the new reality and the new hope of closer and deeper relationships with each other that are provided by recognizing gender change celebrating it and celebrating our chance to be equal partners. Thank you for listening. This episode has been brought to you by Democracy at Work. Please support our work. Visit our website at democracyatwork.info.